Welcome to Enchanted Astrology with Ariel Smith. Thank you for joining me in this episode where we look at the Aries Ingress chart for the astrological new year, which is happening on March 20th at 10:58 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, the Aries Ingress chart is based on the exact moment that the sun enters into the sign of Aries, which is also known as the spring equinox. Now, I'm going to cover the energies of this week as part of this Aries Ingress episode, since the energies of this week, specifically March 20th, will set the tone for the year ahead. And just a quick background on why this is important. Astrology is based on initial conditions. And if you're familiar with the butterfly effect as documented by Edward Lorenz, he was running weather simulations on a computer, and to save time, he restarted the simulation from the middle using numbers from an earlier run that were rounded to 3 decimal places instead of 6. So not a big difference at all. And even though the difference in those numbers, those rounded numbers, was extremely small, the simulation produced completely different weather outcomes. It might as well have been on 2 separate planets. It was so different. So this led to the realization that very tiny differences in starting or initial conditions can lead to huge differences in the outcome. And this is where we get that analogy of the butterfly effect, where a butterfly can flap its wings and that can lead to a hurricane. So this just speaks to how sensitive our highly complex systems are on initial conditions. And so astrology is all about those initial conditions. Your birth chart is based on this, any natal chart. And at the astrological new year, we look at the initial conditions of the Aries Ingress in the spring equinox. And this chart tells us what kind of a year we can expect based on those conditions. Now, this specific Ingress chart is rather special because it does capture that highly talked about Neptune Saturn conjunction in Aries. And I want to offer a little context on why this conjunction that took place at 0 degrees of Aries that happened back in February of this year, why that's so rare and important. Now, from what I can tell, based off of research from other astrologers, as I personally cannot calculate this by hand myself, this conjunction happened approximately 6,000 years ago. So that puts us roughly around 4,000 BC. I have seen some astrologers say precisely 4,361 BC. I can't vouch for that exact date myself, but the consensus seems to be around that 4,000 BC mark. And if we look at what was going on during this time, it's actually quite profound because this is taking us to the birthplace of urban civilization. So when we look at roughly 4,500 BC and prior, we have civilizations that are existing in small villages. So people were pretty much just a farmer or a herder. Families pretty much produced their own food, their own tools and clothing. There were very, very few specialized occupations. It was the era of the self-sufficient homestead. Then around 4,000 to 3,500 BC, we see this expansion in Mesopotamia to form the world's first city. And that is the city of Uruk. the same city made famous by the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Uruk is important because this city introduced some major innovations of the time. So this is like the earliest known writing system, right? We've heard of cuneiform, the earliest documented writing system. We have large-scale temples, grand monumental structures and architecture being built. We're starting to see organized government and administrative type bodies being formed and goods being produced en masse. So we have pottery and artisans and specializations that lead to markets, the development of markets and this exchange. Now, in Uruk, many specialized jobs started to appearing from the formation of the cities. So we have priests, merchants, metal workers, potters, and with the addition of writing in cuneiform, we now have scribes to do all of this writing. So cities allowed people to now focus on specific specialized professions instead of everybody doing everything themselves. The way we governed ourselves and the way we thought of the concept of authority deeply changed. Back in the village life, leadership was probably a little more informal, right? We have elders or respected leaders that are making decisions. They had their kind of pre-urbanization way of governing their village. And in Uruk, we now see organized city government. And we have the development of rulers or kings. We have these administrative bodies starting to control resources and land and food. And that leads to more administrative tasks like record keeping and taxation and these sorts of things. The trade and the economy deeply changed. Back in the village life, mostly local trade, right? You bartered with your neighbor or nearby communities. It was very close knit. And then in Uruk, we now start seeing these very long distance trade routes happening across Mesopotamia. And we start seeing the importation of goods and materials like different metals and stones. And we start to see the development of these large marketplaces where now people are coming together to sell or trade their specialized produced goods. So daily life changed drastically because of this. So before then, it was more just a quiet rural environment. People were self-sufficient. And with Uruk, you now see busy urbanization happening. These busy environments, neighborhoods started becoming more crowded. You start seeing the social hierarchy. You have these rulers or the kings, you have workers, you have slaves, you have all kinds of hierarchies going on in the social structure. So the rise of cities like Uruk changed human life dramatically. So we go from villages to cities with thousands of people. We go from family farming to these specialized professions. We have more informal leadership to an organized government or bureaucracy. And we have individuals having their own religious and spiritual practices going to these shared monumental religious institutions. So it was arguably one of the biggest lifestyle shifts in human history. Now, this isn't to say that the world has not seen urbanization before. If we are considering things and different evidence that has been popping up over the last few years surrounding, pre the Younger Dryas era and the possibility of other advanced civilizations on Earth. This is simply saying that after the Younger Dryas event, we saw a mass period of self-sufficient farming, this way of life where it was the smaller scale, people living in villages. And then around that 4000 BC mark, you see the development of cities. Now, obviously, this is a slow forming change. It doesn't happen overnight. I believe it took about 1,000 years roughly for this specific transformation into urbanized living. So it's not as though you went to sleep in your village and woke up and walked out your door and the next morning all of a sudden there's a city. But it's not that much time considering how drastic this change was. So it has now impacted our entire world because it formed the basis of essentially the world that we know today. And because we are experiencing change more and more rapidly, I don't anticipate it would take necessarily 1,000 years this cycle around to see the same contrast. But I do feel the contrast can be just as profound as the one that took place 4000 BC. Now, those of you who are familiar with Plato's Republic might be able to see a strong parallel here, because in Plato's Republic, Socrates builds an imaginary city with the idea that the city is like a magnified version of the soul. So if we can understand justice in the city, then essentially we can understand it in the soul. And Socrates begins by building a very simple city. And this is synonymous to the little villages that existed around 4500 BC. So people produce their basic needs. They produce their food, their shelter, their clothing, and life in the city is modest and cooperative. And he calls this a healthy city. But in this conversation he has in the Republic, I believe it's Glaucon who rejects this city, and he refers to it as a city of pigs, which basically is that he's referring to it as being boring because it lacks luxuries. So Glaucon says there's no fancy food, no art, no luxury goods, no entertainment. So to satisfy Glaucon, Socrates expands his simple city, and this creates new problems because in order to expand the city requires more land and resources. And this ultimately leads to war. And now the city needs a class of people to defend the city and their goods. And that would be soldiers and an army. So you now have a hierarchy going on with rulers, with the army, and the citizens. And the idea was that if everyone could be satisfied in their role and do it well, theoretically, the city should be able to function. But the problem is that people want more at all levels of classes within the city. And so you have rulers who seek wealth, power, and fame, and this corrupts the system. And Socrates brought in this famous idea about the philosopher king, as he said, cities will have no rest from evils until philosophers rule as kings, or kings truly become philosophers. Because Plato believed that philosophers are uniquely suited to govern because ultimately they seek truth and wisdom rather than wealth, power, or fame. So the reason that I mention this is because it just helps put into perspective what 6,000 year cycle we have just been through, what has been fully explored during that cycle, and what we can imagine that could be changing moving forward in this new cycle now beginning this year. So I believe we can imagine us exploring the feverish city, as Plato calls it, to its full extent in this day and age, right? We have explored fully the life of luxury. I mean, you can get literally anything that you want with the touch of a screen. You can get it in 30 different colors or flavors. You can get any trim style, any add-ons, additions. You can have it now, you can have it later. Goods are being imported from all over the world. I mean, we have shipping containers literally falling into the ocean on their way over, and we just make more. Oh, well, we'll just make some more. So there's no end to how many options or levels of luxury we have created in our own feverish cities. And we have also seen the full corruption, or are really, especially now with everything being disclosed or unveiled, we are seeing the full corruption of kings and rulers and those in a position of power. And as Socrates said, there is no justice in this city. And according to him, that would mean there is no justice in our soul as well. And we can feel that, right? We feel the restlessness in our soul. We feel the injustice, the pain, the grief, and we can seek to numb that with more luxuries, and it just becomes this negative feedback loop. And at what cost has this life of luxury really taken, right? When we look at the environment, the wars, the conflict over resources, all to keep creating more and more and more. And we are fully saturated now with corruption and pollution and war. So I believe we have explored building our feverish cities to the full extent, and that cycle has now come full circle, come to a close. And during this cycle, we can now imagine a different way to build our city within and without. And ultimately, how that looks is up to us, and that's the choice we get to make going forward. So I hope that provides just a little bit of context of what was going on Earth around 6,000 years ago, how much has changed in that cycle, and what have we learned. Now, as for today's chart that we're going to discuss, I pulled this chart specifically for Canada, but it also works for the US as well, since our capital cities share a time zone. And the Aries Ingress chart generally sets the tone for the year. So it's essentially like the year's chart. However, the length of time that the chart is valid for depends upon the sign on the ascendant, and that depends on whether the energies play out quickly or over a long period of time, like the full year, and that varies. And we can also track the year as we go with each cardinal point. So we can pull a chart again for the summer solstice when the sun ingresses into Cancer, for the autumn equinox when the sun ingresses into Libra, and the winter solstice when the sun ingresses into Capricorn. So this year, for our Aries Ingress, for the spring equinox, we have Gemini on the ascendant. So that tells me that the energies of this chart will be valid for about 6 months. And when I looked into the Cancer Ingress chart for this year, we will also have Gemini on the ascendant, which just reinforces that 6-month time frame. So the presenting theme this year is very strongly around communication and information, negotiation, and in general, just being adaptable. So those will be very prominent themes this year over the course of the next 6 months. And Mercury is the ruler of this chart. And Mercury is in retrograde in Pisces, conjunct the North Node. And this energy feels like sorting back through information that was previously obscured in some way. And personally, that could be relooking at information that you previously couldn't absorb, especially if it was maybe triggering to you in some way, or maybe it just appeared to you differently before in a way where you couldn't recognize it as meaningful, or you just weren't resonating with it previously. But now, going back through that information, you see it in a whole new light. You have a whole new internal meaning for it that you previously didn't have. And that is right on time in order to elevate your understanding to a new level so that you can now move forward in a brand new way. Now, Mars is also in Pisces, where he is very intuitively guided and conserves his energy for acting on that intuitive guidance. I think last episode I used the analogy of like the surfer on the wave, where you can't control when the waves come, right? But you being available to when you feel the water rise, when you feel the momentum of the wave, you have the energy available to navigate and ride that wave. So you only have so much energy in a day. And if Mars is busy overachieving, meeting all of the expectations, completing the to-do list, he's exhausting his energy reserves and might not have it in the tank when the intuitive suggestions start coming online, right? Those intuitive suggestions, that guidance can easily be pushed to the I'll do it later list, and likely never or maybe one day list. But in Pisces, he isn't supported to be very direct and assertive with his energy. He's pulled into this conserving mode in order to make sure he has enough available when he receives that guidance. It also makes sure he has enough energy to maintain compassion and empathy and kindness. Because when we are just exhausted, when we have no energy left, it's easier to become short or frustrated with others. And so this Mars feels somewhat shielded from that here. So we have more energy to spend on kindness, on compassion, and following our intuition. It can also be revisiting our use of energy, how much we are giving it away, how unsustainable our use of energy is on a personal and a collective sense. And this can be revisiting how we relate to lower Mars and Mercury themes, and does that align with our evolution and soul growth direction with the presence of the North Node here. As an example, here in Canada, very recently there has been discussion about changing Canada's self-defense law, specifically regarding the use of force against intruders in a home. So a bill has just been introduced this month that would create a legal presumption that the force used against a home invader is justified, unless, of course, evidence shows that it's unreasonable. And supporters say that this would protect homeowners from being charged or forced into long court battles. It's not a law yet, but it is a proposal as an example of this Mercury retrograde in Pisces with that Mars in Pisces energy here. And it is showing that emphasis around communication and how we are perceiving or interpreting things this year. Now, we also have a massive stellium in Aries in this chart. Obviously, the sun is in Aries in every Aries Ingress chart, but we also have Neptune and Saturn in an ongoing conjunction at the early degrees of Aries. So this is the start of a new cycle where we are looking at how we want to structure ourselves personally and globally. So Neptune and Aries can inspire us to nurture our spirituality. It can give us a more potent imagination that we can use in order to create a higher vision for ourselves. And Saturn in Aries gives us self-responsibility. So it can inspire us to take better responsibility and accountability for ourselves and what we are creating in this lifetime. Now, Saturn structures our experiences in Aries closer to the self, where it's immediate and it's personal. So there's less structure in these larger, vague, sort of one-size-fits-all systems. Those systems that are meant to help everyone and sort of end up helping no one because they are so vague that they end up meeting no one's actual needs. So Saturn in Aries is more, let's take each individual need into perspective on an individual basis and work at the level of the individual, not above. And this Neptune-Saturn conjunction is forming a sextile with Pluto in Aquarius, and also a sextile with Uranus at the late degrees of Taurus. So Pluto is supporting this restructuring away from the old hierarchies that we have seen rule this planet for millennia. And in Aquarius, Pluto wants that power to be brought down to the level of each individual as well. So Pluto here is deeply shifting power away from the concept of rulers. And Uranus in Taurus is innovating our material experiences to follow suit with that. So innovations, inventions, basically that we see take place can deeply support us in this shift. So the material world, right, can be used for good or bad. And we tend to focus on the bad first as a survival mechanism. But we have been evolving beyond our survival mechanisms at this point. And this supportive configuration of the outer planets can help us to see the good or use the material world in ways that support our soul and maintain our own individual sovereignty in the process. So this energy is not about giving our power away to external sources, but it's about each individual maintaining their sovereign power. Now, the moon in a collective chart represents the people, the mood, the emotional drive or atmosphere, and the moon in Aries here wants to take action. So it wants to start something new, and it can be impatient because it prefers to be direct over being diplomatic. It's like, just get it out, just say what you need, and let's action it. But the moon is conjunct Venus here in Aries, so that softens this expression. So we want change here, but we still want it in a harmonious way. We prefer to be direct, but not rude. So this is an energy that supports bold new ventures, new creative projects, or new alliances. But if that energy is acted on impulsively, it can fizzle out just as quickly. So, a helpful way to work with this energy is to drop it into the heart in order to settle it down. So, you don't extinguish it, but you drop it into the heart, breathe with it, and it's like putting a boiling pot on to simmer. If you just let it boil, it evaporates quickly and you just burn the dish. But if you simmer it, control the amount of energy being released. You can keep the simmer going and going for a long time, and it just adds flavor. And this is how Jupiter can work here in Cancer, because Jupiter in Cancer is squaring this Venus-Moon conjunction in Aries. So Jupiter in Cancer wants to focus on the long term. It wants to feel safe and secure with what is familiar. It wants to protect and nurture and sustain. So Jupiter is the energy that can adjust the dial to simmer that boiling pot so that it nurtures and sustains rather than just boils and burns. And this Jupiter is also forming a trine to that Mars in Pisces. So that is helping with Mars's energy conservation here. So Mars doesn't burn out and waste energy in all kinds of ways that ultimately distract him from his main goal. And Jupiter here is tempering that energy in Aries to support that. So here we see fire and water working in harmony, which is perfectly reflecting that spring equinox where the sun and its warmth melts the snow, at least here in Canada, where we have lots and lots and lots of snow. And it releases water that nourishes the seed's growth for the year. So I hope this is helpful for how to work with the energy this week as well as the energy for the next 6 months. So if you would like to have a personalized reading of your chart, you can book that with me on my website at enchantedastrology.ca, where I will guide you through your chart and explore what this year holds specifically for you. Now, as always, thank you so much for listening in today. I will be back next week with another episode.